Okay, we're going to get started. I think most of you were here for last session, but we'll just repeat. So Jim Shulin at the last minute couldn't make it here, so Nate and I are pinch hitting. So hopefully we'll get through this. So we'll start. So these are the results we're going to show you from the FY18 AAAEM AAACEM benchmark survey. So just up on the screen there are members of the benchmark committee that work hard to make sure the data is as clean as we can make it and the questions are the correct questions and data to be collected. They're actually members on the committee from both AAACEM and AAAEM. So the survey, normally we capture patient care, teaching, and research, which you heard about in the last session if you were here. But this year we focused on these new areas, but the three areas we're going to highlight today and talk about are boarding information, bed hours / bed utilization, and patient acuity. So as far as the data set goes, and I think Dr. Volturo referred to this, we've been doing this data collection and benchmark survey since 2010. So going back to 15 up to this past year, you can see the number of academic, affiliated, community, freestanding, adult, and pediatrics. So this data we're going to show you today is basically the academic and academic affiliated hospitals put together. As you can see, the last 3 years we've hovered just shy of the 100 number. So as far as the regions go, it's pretty much scattered throughout the country. The Northeast being the most, but the other areas are represented. As far as the whole database goes, we have almost 7 million visits in here, 1.7 million admissions, and almost 700 million in collections. So what does the average ED look like? So if we take all the data turned in again for the academic, primary academic and academic affiliate for last year, the average ED saw 65,000 visits and had a hospitalization rate of approximately 26%. So again, this year we're trying to focus on bed utilization, so the average was 440,000 bed hours for these EDs, and 81% of those hours are in the main or the acute ED. Over on the right shows some median and means for length of stays. Interesting thing on there is the boarding time, 2.9 for the median and 4.7 for the mean, so that's quite a spread. So obviously we have some patients staying quite a long time for boarding. And the bottom two, behavioral health, something new we focused on again this year. Again, if you look at the median and the mean, the spread, it shows that we have some behavioral health patients spending a lot of time in the department. So patient population, some things to highlight here, EMS percentage, which is one of the things we look at when we want to look at acuity. 27.6% are coming in by squad, and of those, 43% are getting admitted. The other thing that jumped out this year as compared to previous years is our geriatric population, so patients over 65, jumped up to 19.7% as an average for the whole group. Previous years it was around 16.5%, so that's quite a big jump, so we'll have to see if it stays up there. So pediatrics, if you do not have a separate pediatric ED, so if you see peds in your adult ED, about 2.5% of your visits are pediatric patients. So if you do have a pediatric ED, you see about 25,000 patients, and as you can see, if you want to do benchmarking, you need to benchmark with other pediatric EDs because obviously it's much different than the adult ED. And actually earlier at this conference, this poster was presented, and this is comparing again the FY17 adult versus peds. So this paper is getting ready to be published. So if we look at the patient volume over the years, again going back to 14, you can see it's fairly flat, so we're not seeing huge growth in total visits. The one interesting thing this past year is that the number of patients discharged, the average number dropped. So we'll see if that continues. Theoretically, it could be impact of freestanding EDs and urgent cares out there taking away our lower acuity patients. Length of stay, flat. Again, you don't really see much change if you go back to 14. Then we decided to look at the subcycle time. So the bed to decision for discharge stays pretty consistent from previous years. Mean 3.4, median 2.8, so roughly 3 hours. And for admitted patients, stayed pretty consistent with previous years, 4.1 for admitted, 3.3 for the median. So again, probably close to 4 hours per admitted patient. But if you look at door to provider below there, you can see we've had a big change going from roughly, 38 minutes back in 12 down to probably below 25 now. So that's a lot of focus on, putting a provider up front, provider in triage. So it looks like it's having an impact, and we're getting to see the patients quicker. So as a result of that, we had a drop in left out being seen rate, so it was down to 2.2%. Obviously, that's a big patient satisfaction measure. The quicker you see patients, hopefully, the happier they'll be, and the quicker we can get them out. So here's some CMS metrics we report. Again, you look at these, they haven't really changed much through the years. Left out being seen did drop a little bit this year. But the big one to highlight here, again, is boarding time. So if you look at boarding time in 16, it was 2.4 hours. And this year, then the median this year is up 2.9. So it's a half-hour increase in 2 years. So that's a big jump. As far as ancillary resource utilization, numbers are staying pretty consistent. The one thing Jim wanted me to make sure we mention here is if you look at the MRI utilization back in 15, it was 1.2%, went up to 2.1 in 18. So it's still not a big percentage of our patients, but it's almost a doubling of the percentage that do get those, get an MRI. And why that's such a big issue, even though it's not a large number of patients, if you look down there at the bottom, median is 4 hours and the mean is 6.7 hours. So for those few extra patients now, whenever you order the MRI, they're going to be there for 7 hours, and it's just going to add again to the boarding and clogging up the ED. So are we seeing sicker patients? These are the 5 metrics we look at every year. Hospitalization rate, your level 4 and level 5 pro fees, acuity, ESI acuity level 1 and 2, EMS arrivals, and EMS submissions. So again, if we compare this data going back 2012, you can see they're all trending up. So again, are we seeing sicker patients? Yes. Yes, if they're admitted, yes, but if they're discharged from OBS, no. So it's just admitted patients. Okay. So again, with seeing this trend, we really have been talking a lot about acuity and how can we measure acuity. So I'm going to show you one more slide here, and then Nate's going to take over and kind of show some of the work we're trying to do to determine acuity in our patients. The other thing with acuity is also complexity. We have some patients that may not be as sick, but they take up a lot of resources or time, and those being our geriatric patients, again, which we said is going up. So it's about, if you look at a trend from 17% to 19.7, that equates to about 1,200 additional patients in the average ED, or about 3.3 per day. And for behavioral health, again, we're seeing almost 2 more per day compared to 14. So again, those patients tend to stay longer. So again, added on to the boarding and add on to more CT or MRI patients, and now this, they all just add on to more complexity and slowing down the whole process. So that being said, I will turn it over to Nate.
Thank you, Greg. Hi, my name is Nate Holt, and I work for Roundtable Analytics. And the work that I'm going to present now is some ongoing research into measures of acuity that's the result of a partnership between AAAEM and SAEM and Roundtable. So a first step in measuring patient acuity is to define the object or quantity to be measured. And in the absence of this definition, you can assume that patient acuity, or you may assume, rather, that patient acuity and patient procedural load, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. In the absence of a definition, you may be willing to assume that patient acuity and patient procedural load or case index are isomorphic. And if you take that a step further, then a summary measure of case mix, like case mix index or some flavor of it, would be representative of the overall patient acuity in your ED, of the patient population arriving to your ED. Hold on 1 second. All right. So how many of you know the CMI for your hospital? Any of the flavors? I know there are several different types. Okay, well, I see a few hands. Great, thank you. And how many of you know the CMI of your peers, your peer EDs or hospitals? Okay, so I guess the rhetorical question is, do you think CMI is a good measure of the underlying acuity of your ED's patient population? And we'll show here in a little bit that, sorry, did the slide just jump? So we'll show in a little bit that if you're actually using CMI to assess your patient acuity, then maybe that's not the way to go about doing it. And so what we're looking at right here is the CMI for inpatients admitted through the ED. And so, we have the column that's, just kind of in the center, it's blue, and you can see that you could potentially sort these EDs by their CMI, and perhaps the ones at the, that wind up at the top, you would say have on average, a more acute patient population than the ones at the bottom. And one primary benefit to doing it this way is that you're just repurposing CMI. So you have CMI, and now you've just turned around and used it to assess your patient population's acuity. And so you've reduced the dimension of the problem. Greg just showed a slide with 5 or 6 different measures of patient acuity, ESI, hospitalization rates, and so forth. So you've reduced the dimension from this 5 or 6 dimensional space down into 1, and now you have a list that you can sort and rank. So our goal here was to create a single number summary that distills this multidimensional space of all these metrics that you may associate with acuity into a single number, right? And so Wolfram Math World defines an index to be a statistic which assigns a single number to several individual statistics in order to quantify trends. And here, so here in the top right panel, you'll see a description of the methodology that we developed. And in the top left, you'll see a histogram showing a plot of the resulting index for primary academic EDs. And basically, we took a few parallel or not quite parallel paths here. And what we did is we said, well, we could think of acuity as a concept that is, measuring the likelihood that you are to be, to die, to be medically admitted, or to require some kind of surgical intervention. So by that definition, a higher acuity patient would be more likely to die, require medical intervention or surgical intervention than a low acuity patient. And that's what you're seeing here is a histogram of the acuity values that we've created. At the bottom here in the table, I think the interesting thing, and this is what I mentioned a little while ago, is that in the orange row you see the correlation. This is the rank order correlation between case mix index and some variables that I was told are associated with acuity. And what you see is the correlation coefficients are pretty low. In the top row, you see the correlation coefficients between the acuity index that we built and these measures of patient acuity. And you see those correlations are much higher. And so the upshot is that if you're looking at case mix index as a measure of patient acuity, that just be aware that you're looking at something that isn't very highly correlated with these variables. And what you're seeing here is a table where the green cell painting represents that's showing the top 10 by several different acuity indexes that we built. And the upshot is that whether or not you include the acuity variables that I showed or the additional complexity variables, you may think of an alternative way to do this would be to include complexity variables like your behavioral health population, or your geriatric population, some measure of those. And whether or not we included the complexity measures, what we found is that the sort order, the ranking, with the resulting index was essentially the same. And so we just said, well, let's go ahead and take the simpler path. And so we also did a sensitivity, and pardon me. I'm sorry here. The slides that I just uploaded, I thought they're looking a little different than the ones I practiced with. So I'm seeing some of this in this order for the first time myself. So what we're seeing here is we've taken some EDs and we've anonymized them, but we've plotted or we've written down their acuity index here on the left, and then we have some of the measures that go with the acuity index. And what we'll see is that EDA and EDD and quantum, those are pretty easily distinguished on the basis of the metrics. If you look at any of the individual metrics, you would say, okay, well, on the basis of the percent hospitalized, EDA dominates ED, and therefore it makes sense to sort it in order with that. The more interesting thing here, though, is when you look at ED, and C, if you choose any individual metric, the order in which you would rank them may change. And the benefit of having an index is that now you have a single numeric quantity on which you're sorting. And we did another variation where we incorporated case mix indexes. So we took case mix index values, we added them to the acuity index we built. What we found is that essentially the sort is the same. And so at this point, we're looking at our next steps. Where do we go from here? Well, we're going to continue to collect conventional survey data, and if we're not participating, we do. And we're going to continue to calculate the index scores we have. This is like version 1 that you're seeing here. And we're going to continue to assess the associations, or the correlations rather, between case mix index and the underlying variables that are included in the acuity index. We're also refining the methodology. So one thing we're doing is borrowing from the psychometrics literature, the measurement scales literature. So we've done an alternative version of the index where we look at when we do a principal components analysis, and we take the dispersion of the components, the absolute values, the factor values, and those become weights into the index formula. And so that's another approach that we're taking. And really what we're hoping to land on at the end is that there's a convergence of all the various indexes that we build. And that's really what we're seeing now. But I think the last row of our next step is really important. And that is to develop an index based on patient level data. Right? So acuity is an individual phenomenon. And so it makes sense that just like we wouldn't compute average BMI by summing the masses and the heights of some population and looking at, say, the ratio of those aggregates. We would rather compute a mean based on the individual BMI. That's probably where I think we should be landing with patient acuity index. There should be a measure of acuity at the individual level, then you're aggregating and summarizing. And so that's probably the direction we're going, but this is still an area of active research because that started a few months ago. So that's where we are. With that, I'm going to hand back to Greg.
Thanks, sir. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about boarding. So for our survey, or for our data collection, we define boarding as the time from when the admit order goes in to the time the patient goes out the door. So as you look at all this data, that's what it's based upon. So again, I think we've all felt the pain of boarding. So we have two different sets of data here regarding boarding. It's the whole survey, all the data from all the different participants. And again, as Dr. Vulturo reported earlier, that we had a smaller sample we collected data from. So we're going to show results, boarding data from both those sets. So again, boarding, it's not an issue for the ED. Again, it's more of a health system issue. So either inefficiencies for your inpatient operations or lack of capacity, not having enough beds. So as far as boarding time goes, again, we kind of referred to this. I referred to this when I spoke earlier. The boarding time is going up. Again, if you go back to 14 compared to now 18, both the mean and the median has gone up. So again, the median from 4 to 4.7, and then the median from 2.5 to 2.9. So again, not the direction we want to see the boarding time go. So not only is it important to see the mean and the mean, but we need to look at the distribution. How long are the patients actually staying? So again, this is all the data compiled for primary, academic, and academic affiliate. So if you break it down in hour chunks, So the blue line, the first line is 0 to 1 hours, the red line is 1 to 2 hours, so forth, all the way up to the last line, which is greater than 24 hours. So if we bucket into 4-hour blocks, so 1 to 4 hours, 2/3 of the patients are out in that time period. But the disturbing piece is if you go over to the right side, 14.6% spend more than 8 hours boarding in the departments. So the mean, 4.7, the median, 2.9. Okay, so this is, again, average, everything rolled together. So this is actual data from one of our institutions, probably maybe the best data coming in for boarding per institution. So this institution, again, 1 to 4 hours, 80% of their patients are out. Greater than 8 hours, 7.2%. So their mean is 3.1%. Okay, so again, this is kind of the best performer in our database, 3 hours for their mean. This next one is probably has the most difficulty with boarding. Again, an actual members data. So less than 4 hours, 1/3 of their patients. But if you look at greater than 8, they have 36% of their patients. And their mean is almost 9 hours. So again, comparing the best performer at 3 hours to this performer at 9 hours, you have 6 hours more boarding at this institution than the other. Just multiply that by your number of boarding patients. Obviously, you can see what that does to your throughput. So if we roll all this together, and again, going back, looking back from 2012, so again, the first chunk shows less than 4 hours, middle chunk 4 to 8, and the right side greater than 8 hours. So if we look at the trend for those three groupings, you can see, again, going the wrong way. So patients less than 4 hours went from basically 3/4 of patients to 2/3, but the ones over 8 hours basically doubled, going from 7% to over 14%. So again, boarding causes crowding, causes length of stay issues, causes patients to leave without being seen. And based upon what's going on in the industry, it's a natural cause, again, directly related to inpatient occupancy, downsizing of capacity. So what Jim wanted to show here was policymakers over the last few years have been trying to wring out what they deemed as excess capacity. So there's some graphs showing number of hospitals have been downsized to 4% since 2010, and you can see across the country, depending on where you live, you may feel the pain more than others. Again, very, very regionally specific how much this impacts you. But again, number of patients aren't going down. If anything, they're going up a little bit, but the capacity for us to admit them to is actually going down, which again is just going to make boarding worse. So what Jim has come up with is this queuing graph. So what we're showing here is along the bottom, the utilization, that is basically the occupancy percentage of your institution. So what it's showing is once you hit 87%, the number of patients, the blue line, number of patients waiting, really sharply increases, and the yellow line is how long they wait. So again, as you hit that 87% capacity, you don't have anywhere to send these patients, or it's much harder to get them upstairs. And we're not the only ones that want the room, right? Of course, we have boarding in the ED, but we also have the OR who want to get their patients out of the PACU. And again, the transfers want to come from outside hospitals. They want to get their patients in. So all that demand, once you hit that 87%, everything's starting to back up. So again, when this backs up, it's going to impact left without being seen, length of stay for all the patients, obviously, and then we're going to lose revenue, and it's just going to make our bed utilization much higher than it should be. So for the left without being seen rate, compared to the compared to the inpatient occupancy. So what we have down there along the bottom, which says AAAEM 25th percentile, AAAEM 50th percentile, that's the boarding hours, so your average boarding hours are down there. And then what's that shown against is the blue line is the left without being seen rate, and then the black line is your impact on your pro fees. So obviously, as you go higher up the AAAEM percentile, your left without being seen rate goes up. So what this actually means to your financials, if you're at the 75th percentile, for example, a 4% left without being seen rate, that means you're going to lose about $306,000 in revenue that you could have collected. If you're at the 90th percentile, like a 6% left without being seen rate, it's over $500,000 that you're losing in charges. So not only does it impact left without being seen, it also impacts obviously length of stay. So again, this is showing along the x-axis the boarding times at the different percentiles for AAAEM. And then the two lines, again, the black line is length of stay for discharged patients, and the blue is just length of stay for all patients. So it's kind of hard to see on this graph, but actually as you go up on the boarding percentile, your length of stay for discharged patients actually goes up. So the next graph here is just showing discharges only. And again, along the X is the AAAEM boarding percentile. So what happens, once you hit that magic 87%, this is actual data that was pulled out of our survey. You can see the slope, it just shoots right up with length of stay. So again, it may not be a lot of time, it may only be 5 or 10 minutes, but it has a big impact on how many patients you can't see then because you have patients longer in the beds. Even though they're admitted patients, they still impact your discharge length of stay. So the 4 hours happens to be that sweet spot. Once you hit 4 hours, that's when your discharge length of stay is going to start to shoot up. So all the boarding, what does it do? It impacts our bed utilization. So bed utilization is basically how many bed hours do you have available. So this is pretty simple math. If you have one bed and it's open for 24 hours, right, you have 24 bed hours. 2 beds, 48. 3 beds, 72. So the average ED in our benchmark survey has 42 acute care beds. Those beds, if they're open 24 hours a day, we have about 1,000 hours a day, or 367,000 bed hours in a year. So the question is, what % of the bed hours are we using? And using the term dwell time, which is the amount of time the patient's in the bed, not counting the time before they get into a bed. So it's not total length of stay, but it's, again, patient time in the bed. So what % of time are we using? So again, it's supply versus demand. So again, number of bed spaces times operational hours gives you your total supply, and then the demand, number of patients, and the dwell time, how long are they in the beds. So Jim shared this, and this is an actual report from Hopkins, and they've been tracking this since 2015. So it is basically showing for these 3 areas, for their observation area, their utilization rate last year was 82.3%. Their north bed area was 94%. And then their main bed was basically at 100% capacity, so didn't have any empty bed time. So again, if we look at all of our primary academic data and the total bed hours, where they're being used, 40% of our bed hours is being used for discharged patients. 16% is going to be used to take care of patients that we're going to admit, and 18% is going to be used for boarding patients. Behavioral health, then 10%, OBS, 9%, and then discharge delay, 7%. So 18% of our beds, almost 20% of our bed hours available is eaten up by boarded patients. Another way to look at this graphically would be just to look at the beds. So throughout the whole year, if you take all your beds, 20 of them are going to be used for discharges, 8 for admitted patients, 3 for discharge delays, 9 for boarders, 5 for behavioral health, and 5 for OBS. Just another way to look at the data. So what is the impact? Again, another Hopkins report that Jim wanted to share. What does this mean? So what he has is 25% of their population are admitted, and they're using 47% of their available bed hours. But boarding ends up using 36% of their available bed hours. So what does this end up doing? For example, this ED has 29 beds. If you look at the second piece of data down here, circled in red, has 29 total beds, but at that volume, and when there's 12 of the beds being used for boarders, you really only have 17 beds to treat patients coming in. So in other words, that ED is actually only 29 beds, but in reality it needs to be 41 beds because you have all those boarders to take care of. So again, bed utilization has these 3 variables, right? The volume, how many patients are coming in, time, what's their dwell time, how long they're going to be in the bed, and the space, how many bed hours you have available. So when you're working in the department, if these 3 things are in sync, everything's nice and fine and smooth. If one of these things gets out of whack, that's when you start having issues. And I'll see the big issue is space. So here again is actual data taken from our survey. So we have hospital A and hospital B. So again, we have the demand side with volume, the demand side with the time, and the supply side with how much space we have. So if you compare these two hospitals, they look fairly similar. The volumes aren't real far off, 36,000, 42,000. They admit almost the same amount of patients, but hospital A has more than twice the behavioral health patients as hospital B. Dwell times aren't real far off, except the boarding dwell time. Again, hospital A, 8.9 hours to 2.7, so more than 6 hours for boarding time per patient. And then the bed hours, the total capacity is very close again. So if we look at how does this translate to bed hour utilization, again, the bed hours were close, but the dwell time demand for A is much higher than B. And again, that's because they have twice the amount of behavioral health patients, and their dwell time per boarded patients is much higher. So as you can see, hospital A is at 101% utilization rate, whereas hospital B is at 74%. So much different EDs to work in based basically off of your behavioral health volume and your average boarding time. So we also did this for the smaller group that Dr. Voltura referred to, and this is the results that came out of there. That group, the average was 10,000 boarding hours per year is what each of those EDs spent. And again, this is just showing that percent of boarding time that eats up your beds in the main ED is 35%. So that hospital there shows 48 total beds. Well, actually 17, well, Jim has 18 at the bottom, are being used up for boarders. So you actually only have 30 beds or 63% of your capacity to treat patients. Overall utilization for this was 91%. So again, taking it back to his supply and demand curve that he had, once you hit that 87% number, it just shoots up. So again, he threw in another report from Hopkins. So this is showing the gold line is basically their boarding hours, and along the bottom is the percent occupancy of Hopkins. So what he's showing is once they hit 94%, everything falls apart because there's no beds and everything's just backed up. But the unfortunate thing for Hopkins is 90% of the time they're greater than 94% occupancy. So they feel a lot of pain because of this. So again, boarding, you guys all know all about it, beating a dead horse with the issues with boarding. But as you can see, it has a big impact on the actual number of available beds you have to treat new incoming patients. So again, what does your ED look like based upon all this? So based upon the data, again, Dr. Voltura mentioned that we collected data at Monday at 5 o'clock, because we always hear Monday at 5 o'clock, or Mondays are the worst days, and 5 o'clock is probably one of the busiest hours. So we asked, what does the average ED look like? So when we surveyed all these institutions, we came up with the average was 87 patients in the department at 5 o'clock on a Monday. And those patients in the main ED, there's 53 of those. 45 are in the beds, and 8 are stuck in hallways. So again, if you just do the higher math on these patients in the main ED, again, the 53 patients, 45 in the beds, 8 in the hallway, it's not real complicated math, 121% occupancy percentage. So again, not ideal. Again, now as far as acuity goes, what does that mix of patients look like in the main ED, those 53 patients? You have one level 1 ESI acuity level, 23 are level 2, 26 are level 3, and 3 or 4 and 5s. As far as boarders go, at 5 o'clock on a Monday, you have 18 boarders, and 1 or 2 of those are ICU boarders. And the average boarding time is almost 7.5 hours. We also have ED 8 in OBS. And then the waiting room has 22 patients in there. And of those 22 patients, 9 of them have waited more than 45 minutes. So that's kind of what the average ED, academic ED, seems to look like at 5 o'clock on a Monday. So then the question was, what happens between 5 and 6 o'clock? Are things getting any better? So again, we collected the data, and you can see 13 patients come in, 3 came in by squad. We had 12 decisions, 3.5 were hospitalized, 7 discharged, 1 placed in OBS. 11 patients actually left. 2.2 boarders went up to the floor, and you see we have 1 to 2 who actually just left. So the bottom line is all this activity between 5 and 6, your actually works off at 6 o'clock. You have another 2.6 patients in the department. So again, Monday's definitely feeling a lot of pain. So then, as Dr. Archual mentioned, we said, well, what does it look like on a Thursday? Is it any different? So if you look at the change column, there's a lot of green, so things are better on Thursdays. Census is lower. We have less patients in the waiting room. The patients that waited greater than 45 minutes have lowered, so things look better. But you can see there are 4 reds on there, and if we circle the 4 reds, boarding time has gone up by 1.5 hours. And why is that? Because if you look at hospital occupancy percentage, it's higher on Thursday than it is on Monday. Because you come in on Monday and the hospital is emptied out for the weekend. By Thursday, it's filled back up. So even though Mondays are high volume days, and we always say they're the busiest days, Thursdays, you get towards the end of the week, your capacity is going down, boarding's probably getting worse. So probably feeling pain every day. It's just volume versus boarding getting worse.